Greetings, fellow travelers through the liturgical year. This is Lisa Davis with another Feast Day Quick Take on a day that recognizes two saints that are special family patrons for us, both heroes of the Church, both from the 6th century, one a queen who saved pretty much all of Europe, one a prince turned priest, turned hermit, turned abbot, who built a dynasty of holy Irish monks that went on to, in effect, convert most of the Western world. First, Saint Clotilda. This one's for our granddaughter Chloe. It was nothing short of a miracle that Saint Clotilda wasn't murdered as a child, much less that she was actually raised Catholic. Born in the 6th century amidst the violence of a world still in the throes of transition after the end of the Roman era, with a young church no less chaotic, battling against Arianism, Clotilda had the misfortune to be born into a royal family poisoned by this heresy. Her uncle, Gondebald, the King of Burgundy, in order to usurp their lands, killed Clotilda's parents and all but one of her uncles. By the will of God, however, Clotilda and her sisters' lives were spared, and though they were brought up in Gondebald's Arian household, by some miracle of divine providence, they were instructed in the Catholic faith. Clotilda's sister Crona somehow managed to escape to the convent, but Clotilda, admired for her, quote from Butler's, wit, beauty, meekness, and piety, became a sought-after bride amongst several kingdoms' bachelor princes who recognized an attractive diplomatic tie when they saw one. In the end, it was a pagan, Clovis I, the powerful king of the Franks, who won her hand, but only after agreeing to all of Clotilda's provisions, including the one most important to her, the guarantee that she could freely practice her Catholic faith. And so they were married, with great pomp and ceremony, in 493. And Clovis, by all accounts, kept his promise, and seems to have been a good husband, as warrior king husbands went in the 6th century. But Clotilda wanted more for herself, her husband, her marriage, and her kingdom than an affable marriage free of persecution. She wanted a truly Catholic husband, and she wanted the Arian kingdom of France converted to the true faith. And this is how she attained that goal. Quoted from Butler's 1949 edition. Clotilda made herself a little oratory in the royal palace, in which she spent much time in fervent prayer and secret mortifications. Her devotion was tempered with discretion, so that she attended all her business at court, was watchful over her maids, and did everything with a dignity, order, and piety which edified and charmed the king and his whole court. Her charity to the poor seemed a sea which could never be drained. She honored her royal husband, studied to sweeten his warlike temper by Christian meekness, conformed herself to his humor in things that were indifferent, and the better to gain his affection, made those things the subject of her discourse and praises, in which she saw him take the greatest delight. When she saw herself mistress of his heart, she did not defer the great work of endeavoring to win him to God, and often spoke to him on the vanity of his idols and on the excellency of the true religion. Butler's continues, the king also heard her with pleasure, but the moment of his conversion was not yet come. It was first to cost her many tears, severe trials, and earnest perseverance. After the baptism of their second son Clodomir, and the infant's recovery from a dangerous indisposition, she pressed the king more boldly to renounce his idols. End quote. At this time the king was on his way to a conversion, but he was not there yet. With patient perseverance and trust, Saint Clotilda stepped up the prayers and quiet penances, and any gentle instruction her husband was willing to hear, setting the scene, you might say, until God stepped in with a kind of persuasion that a warrior king understands. In those days, a king always had some battle to plan, fight, or reminisce about, and no less Clovis, whose spiritual struggle would coincide with an earthly one. Engaged in a make-or-break confrontation with a neighboring tribe called the Alemanni, the Franks found themselves in a desperate situation. All eyes turned to Clovis, their valiant king, their unbeaten general, master of the endgame, in trusting expectation. "What now?" asked 3,000 silent faces. "How will you save the day?" Clovis had no answer, and no counsel above himself, no one more capable or experienced, no one who dared, moreover, to make suggestions, and the mighty king had no idea how to save the day. Clovis concentrated on keeping a stern countenance while his mind whirled frantically through past campaigns, scrambling for solutions. Then he heard her voice. Funny how Clotilda's wisdom and humor had become the voice in his head, his conscience, his map, his peace, and now his solution. The king heard in Clotilda's lilting voice her oft-repeated phrase, "Ask, and it will be given. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be open unto you." His wife's voice in his head, urging him, as she always did, to pray. Not to his heathen gods, but to the God that Clotilda knew, loved, and depended upon. What did he have to lose at this point? Without any other option, Clovis prayed. But he prayed in the way of a diplomat more than a warrior, by making a deal. If Clotilda's God could manage the impossible, and he and his men made it out alive and victorious, he vowed to be baptized in the Catholic faith. The rest is history. And by history, I mean his story. God, in other words, took the situation in hand. Knowing full well that Clovis was good for his word, he provided for the Franks to miraculously defeat the Alemanni, a victory that consolidated power in Gaul, setting up the kingdom for changes yet to come. When Clovis returned victorious and told his wife how the battle was won, Clotilda wasted no time, sending her speediest messenger to Saint Remigius, Bishop of Reims, telling him to prepare for a royal baptism. I probably don't need to tell you the joyful tears Clotilda shed and the prayers of thanksgiving she sent heavenward. After a time of instruction and preparation, Saint Remigius baptized King Clovis on Christmas Day in the year 496, along with 3,000 of his soldiers. Reims Cathedral was packed to the rafters for the solemn occasion that Christmas Day, the overflow congesting all the streets and byways surrounding the great church. Picture the scene. The faithful are packed cheek to jowl into every nook and cranny of the nave. As the story goes, the cathedral is so crowded that the cleric appointed to deliver the sacred chrism for the baptismal anointing is unable to squeeze through the crowd to reach the bishop standing at the front, next to the king and queen, grave and patient, resplendent in their royal robes. The cleric with the oils trapped at the far end of the nave, however, is frantic and raises his hand to get the bishop's attention, thinking that an official announcement might clear a path. But when he finally catches his eye, the bishop, St. Remigius, assessing the sardine-packed cathedral, grimaces, shakes his head at the cleric, then folds his hands in silent prayer. Miraculously, a dove appears as if from nowhere, descending from the rafters with a vial of oil in its grasp. St. Remigius then anoints Clovis with the miraculous chrism, and this holy oil is used to anoint the kings of France for the next 1,300 years. True story. The holy ampulla was used in the coronation of French kings for a millennium. Maybe a subject for a Did You Know feature sometime this summer. This is not the final scene in the story of St. Clotilda, though. She went on to live a long life, surviving the death of Clovis by 34 years, remaining a positive Catholic influence in France through many years of conflict and strife amongst their 4 sons, caused by the greed for land and power. The failings of her evil uncle relived. But her life of prayer, penance, and pious resignation surely benefited France, the eldest daughter of the Church, for generations. God blessed King Clovis as the first Catholic king of the West. The conversion of the Franks consequently upended the foothold of Arianism in the West, ensuring the triumph of the Catholic Church in Europe, and ushering in the era of Christendom. All due to the heroic faith of Saint Clotilda, who finally found peace in a holy death in 545 AD. As is true with many saints, we don't have a date of canonization for Saint Clotilda. Having gone to her heavenly reward in the 6th century, her cause long predated the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. Before the 12th century, saints were recognized by popular acclaim. It wasn't until Pope Alexander III was faced with some controversies in 1170 that all candidates for sainthood were required to be approved. Subsequently, the strict canonization process was developed, until it was destroyed by Vatican II in the 1960s, which is another story for another day. The other saint commonly found on the June 3rd square on our Catholic calendars, and another family patron saint, is Saint Kevin of Glendalough. And this one's for you, Kevy, as well as our friend Kevin Strain and all other Kevins. According to the ancient account, the Acta Sanctorum Hibernia, preserved in the Franciscan records in Dublin, Kevin, the son of noble parents, Cumlog and Cumel of Leinster, was born circa 498 AD at the Fort of the White Fountain and baptized by St. Cronin of Roscrea. The Gaelic pronunciation of St. Kevin's name, Cummion, means fair begotten or of noble birth. Many details of his life have been obscured by the mists of time, as they say, but this is what we do know. St. Kevin was the founder and first abbot of Glendalough Monastery in County Wicklow, Ireland, which is about 40 miles south of Dublin. He was baptized by St. Cronin, and the venerable Catholic Encyclopedia records that St. Petroc of Cornwall, who had been studying in Ireland during Kevin's youth, became his teacher and mentor, inspiring him to aspire to religious life. He studied for the priesthood in Kilnamanagh, which is located today in a suburb of Dublin, and incidentally translates to Church of the Monks. At some point, and it's unclear whether this was before or after his seminary studies were complete, young Kevin left home and family to pursue the life of a hermit in a tiny hermitage that he carved out of a hillside in the Glen of Two Lakes, or Glendalough. Overlooking the two lakes of the glen from about 30 feet above the water, young Kevin foresaw, or hoped to see, a life of solitude and contemplation of holy things, undisturbed by the drama and distraction of mankind. And seeing as his hermitage was almost completely hidden, far off the beaten track in a glacial valley that at that time didn't even have a name, Kevin figured he'd be pretty safe to pursue his contemplations with God, his only neighbor. God and mice and squirrels and rabbits and deer and foxes and all other 4- and 6- and 8-footed variety of creatures of the woodland, along with many, many birds that made a racket, not always tuneful, but always joyful, and friends of Kevin's, innocent of malice, reminders of God's generosity and his creativity. As time passed, Kevin became embedded in the world of the glen. Similar to the sensibilities of St. Francis of Assisi, he found peace and joy in nature. He preached to the fish in the lakes and offered mass before the rabbits and the squirrels, it said. He gleaned lessons in hard work and a handy little pond from the beavers, and honey from the beehives in a thicket near the lower lake. It's said that many of the miracles surrounding St. Kevin were in connection to the animals. They helped him, and he in return helped them. Which leads us to the well-known and beloved legend of today's saint. Kevin's first rough hermitage was little more than a crevice he dug into the hill. The dappled green tree tops of a grove of sessile oaks waved like a moving carpet on the shoulder of the hill to the side of his little grotto, a rock shelter barely big enough to stretch out in. The ceiling, if you could call it that, was too low for him to sit upright. Still, when he awakened this particular day in the first gray light of dawn, Kevin turned as he always did to look out the mouth of his little cave to greet the day with prayer, as he watched the rising sun illuminate the familiar characters of the natural world that kept him company. Circling the lakes, holly, rowan, ash, and hazel trees swayed in the breeze that lapped at the water below. A speckled rabbit nibbled on a patch of wild lettuce a few feet away on the hillside where he prayed his daily breviary. And surrounding all, the morning songs of the birds. So many birds chirped and warbled and whistled, hidden in the branches of the trees, that the sound was almost palpable, a wild creature itself. The sky above the green crest of trees on the opposite hill soared to gold and blue heights with the rising sun, pure and clear and grace-filled as the flowing mantle of the Blessed Virgin, deep and limitless as the omnipotent God. Kevin stretched his arms out of the mouth of the cave, opening his palms to the heavens, and closed his eyes, absorbed in the thought, the eyes of his soul feasting on a celestial view. He wasn't sure how long he'd lain there, hands turned toward heaven, but after a time Kevin was roused from his meditations by a puff of warm breeze ruffling his hair, then the sound of the birds, loud and enthusiastic in their springtime joy as always, but oddly close by, practically in his ear. At the same instant he realized this, he noticed that one of his outstretched hands resting on the rocky ledge was no longer empty. Something warm and soft filled the palm of his left hand. He opened his eyes and, turning his head, gazed straight into the shiny, bead-like black eyes of a crow, a glossy, raven-hued jackdaw, which is a type of small crow. Tilting her head meaningfully, the bird opened her beak in a small burp of a chirpy caw, casually laid an egg right in Kevin's hand, then snuggled down cozily as if she were planning to stay. What a wonder, right? What would you do if this happened to you? I'm not sure what I would do, but here's what all the Irish hagiographers tell us that St. Kevin did. The story goes on that in awe of the beauty of God's creation, and out of respect for the maternal instinct of the mama crows choosing Kevin's nice warm hand for a nest, our saint lay with his arms stretched out on that ledge until the egg hatched and the baby bird was able to fly away. It had to have been God's will that a bird should do such a thing, so Kevin honored the challenge, the penance, for indeed it had to have been one, of seeing the thing through. How, you may ask, did St. Kevin, who was a lone hermit, survive doing this? I looked it up. It takes 16 to 18 days for a crow egg to hatch. That is a long fast. We're not told the details of how he accomplished it, but seeing as Kevin is a saint, one of many great saints of the Emerald Isle, we can guess that he managed the feat with a prayerful mixture of love, sacrifice, determination, humor, and almost definitely some practical measures that would make perfect sense if we knew what they were. Isn't this the basic recipe for sanctity that we see in all the lives of the saints? And just a side note, I wonder if he weren't able to get up and walk around carrying the egg and the mama bird with him. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Anyway, I digress. Kevin carried on with the life of a hermit in Glendalough for 7 years, living a life of penance and prayer, eking out a bare but joyful existence from the land. It's said he dressed in animal skins, went barefoot, and spent his time in prayer and penance, perfectly content that this was God's will for him, until, as so often happens in the lives of the saints, word of St. Kevin's holy life somehow found its way out to the public. No accidents in the universe, right? And the next thing Kevin knew, a camp of young men had appeared at the bottom of the hill near his lake. Good young men, pious young men, all begging for direction in the spiritual life. Kevin couldn't escape God's hand in this turn of events, and armed with the wisdom of his years of contemplation and the power of God's holy will, the settlement of young men turned out some of Ireland's first monks, building what would become a world-renowned seminary of saints and scholars. And then what about St. Kevin? We know that he was at some point ordained to the priesthood by Bishop Lugudus, though I can't find the date of his ordination. Records exist that tell of St. Kevin's visit in 544 to the hill of Ishnach in County Westmeath to visit the holy abbots Columba, Cumgall, and Connick. We know he also visited the monastery of Clonmacnoise in County Offaly, just missing St. Kieran, who had died 3 days before his arrival. By this history, we see that over his lifetime, he developed and benefited by a network of monasteries and fellow saintly abbots, with which he kept contact and traded support. We know that at some point he made a pilgrimage on foot to Rome to implore the Pope to make Glendalough a place of pilgrimage, which was in fact allowed, making Glendalough one of the 4 principal pilgrimage places of Ireland. 7 visits to Glendalough equals 1 pilgrimage to Rome. And so the decades rolled on for our Irish monks, powered by work and prayer until, having firmly established his community, St. Kevin pursued once more, as so many holy abbots did, his original desire to live as a hermit. He was able to retire mostly into solitude, serving as the titular abbot of Glendalough for the rest of his life, but only returning to the monastery when necessary. The records on the timing of this phase of his life are a little vague, but it appears that this semi-solitude lasted for 4 years, before our venerable abbot passed to his eternal reward in the year 618, reportedly having reached 120 years of age. He is one of the patron saints of the Diocese of Dublin and can be easily identified in Catholic art by the crow he's carrying in his hands. As you might guess, he's also associated with the patronage of the natural world, of wild birds, and of blackbirds in particular. Along with crows, today's saint is identified by the symbol of the cross of St. Kevin. This ancient Celtic cross found at Glendalough, and ubiquitous in the symbolism of Ireland in general, was carved from a single piece of stone with a distinctive circle symbolizing eternity. A hallmark of the ruins of the ancient monastery, the cross still stands and can be seen today on the edge of the ancient cemetery in Glendalough. A local legend surrounding St. Kevin's cross claims that anyone who can wrap their arms around the width of the cross and close the circle by touching fingertips will, quote, have their wishes granted. Now, this is a secular superstition, of course, a corruption, but one with roots in Catholic teaching, rising no doubt from truths taught by St. Kevin, that prayers are often answered for those who have embraced the cross. Another connection to the traditional symbolism of Ireland is St. Kevin's harp. Interestingly, it's an old belief that when Kevin wrote the rule for his monastery, he set it to music, which he played on a harp. No ancient harp belonging to the monastery exists, except in legend. But you can still go to Ireland and see Glendalough and what remains of the monastery and the original 7 churches reputed to have been built in the valley. The original tiny hermitage of St. Kevin, called St. Kevin's Bed or St. Kevin's Grotto, is visible from across the upper lake. Also still surviving from among the ruined ancient buildings is the so-called St. Kevin's Kitchen, a distinctive landmark but not original to the time of St. Kevin himself. The chapel originated around 500 years later, sometime around the turn of the first millennium, as part of the still thriving monastery founded by St. Kevin. Many churches rose and eventually crumbled within the monastery grounds at Glendalough over 1,500 years, but this humble chapel alone survived, almost intact. A tiny building with stone walls and roof, it originated as a chapel with no more than a simple nave, plus the unusual feature of a round 4-story bell tower, one of only 2 surviving in Ireland. It was this round bell tower, which resembles a chimney more than a bell tower, that gave rise to the nickname St. Kevin's Kitchen. St. Kevin's long-standing cultus was confirmed by Pope Leo XIII in 1902, and he was officially canonized by Pope Pius X in 1908. St. Kevin and St. Clotilda, pray for us. Blessed be God in his angels and in his saints. Happy blessed name day, Kevin and Chloe.